Welcome to All Things Green. I'm Shelby, and today I'm joined by a very special guest. Doug Smits is a U.S. Air Force veteran and a law student at Case Western Reserve University with an interest in using law to fight for the environment. Doug, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks. Great to be here.
I'm excited to talk to you a little bit more about your career in the Air Force and also what you're doing now in law school. But why don't we just start by getting to know you a little bit better? So tell me, where are you from?
Definitely. Growing up, my dad was a scientist, so I was born in Wisconsin, and then because he was in research science, moved around a little bit. When we lived in Massachusetts, that's when I decided to join the military. While I was living in Massachusetts, that's when 9/11 happened, and so that's kind of the main inspiring point to get me to enlist. And also had some family members in the military, so I figured now's my chance to do it, and then hopefully for a good cause.
Yeah, and you just mentioned two different states. Did you move around a little bit growing up?
Yes.
Okay, gotcha.
So, yeah, I moved around a little bit growing up, moved around quite a bit in the military too, as it's expected.
Yes, definitely. I can relate to that. My dad was a U.S. Army veteran, is a U.S. Army veteran, and I moved 9 times before I left for college, so that's very relatable. What are some of the places that you were growing up and then maybe places you were stationed once you joined the Air Force?
Yep, so joined the military from Massachusetts, and then once I joined the military, I went to the Explosive Ordnance Disposal School, which is in Eglin, Florida, which is right there on the Panhandle by Destin. Beautiful
Cool.
area.
Yeah.
Then from there, went to McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey, and then from McGuire back to the Panhandle as an instructor at the EOD schoolhouse, and then went to F.E. Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming, then Japan in
Wow.
Misawa, and then back to Wright-Patterson.
Cool.
And so Wright-Patterson in Dayton, and then that's what brought us to the Ohio region, and so that's what got us here.
Awesome. Okay, so you mentioned this terminology, EOD. Will you define that for me?
Yeah, definitely. So EOD in the military, all 4 branches have it, and it's known as Explosive Ordnance Disposal.
Okay.
And it's kind of like the military bomb squad.
Oh, okay. Wait, I'm going to need you to paint more of a picture of that for me.
Yeah.
That's quite a powerful image.
Yeah, definitely. It's a job where you have a really diverse mission set, very rewarding. One of the main components of it is to try to keep people safe from explosive hazards on a battlefield. Probably what it's more commonly known as is, especially in the War on Terror, like diffusing IEDs in Iraq and Afghanistan and stuff like that. But actually, another big component of it is the environmental piece. And so what's in a lot of those IEDs and in other sets of those other aspects of those mission sets is getting rid of old ordnance and old remnants of war, which is also known as hazardous waste.
Got it. So it sounds like you're talking about, and correct me if I'm wrong, taking care of this sort of like remnants of bombs and things, both during active war, but also afterwards. So you're protecting not just service members in the military, but also civilians that live in those areas. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're seeing it a lot on the news and all the weapons all over the place. And that counts as, things that are dropped from planes, things that are shot out of artillery, landmines, and then things that are improvised or essentially made behind the scenes by somebody. And so what happens is a lot of those things will build up in those areas and is essentially hazardous waste and really dangerous to the environment and people. And then you also see that in other aspects too, where, in the military, pilots and soldiers and airmen, they have to practice. And so what that also turns into is in the practice ranges or the bombing ranges and stuff like that is you'll see that and it'll accumulate out there on the ranges. And so that hazardous waste essentially accumulates out there. And so one of the jobs for an EOD tech is to go out there and essentially clean it up and kind of reduce the amount of waste that's on like those target sites and stuff like that.
This might sound like an obvious question, but what makes it hazardous waste? It's already, especially if they're practicing, it's already been fired out of a gun or whatever has happened to it. And you can tell my ignorance in this field, but what makes it hazardous when it's just a shell or just the remnants of something like that?
Well, there's a lot of depends there.
Sure, I'm sure.
So a lot of times too, they might not go off. So yeah, if the bomb doesn't go off, then you have something that could be really dangerous. If you touch it or move it, it could go off, and that's really dangerous. You also have old pieces of metal out there. You have, if the practice munition does contain live explosives, the live explosives could be toxic and have chemicals in it. There can be batteries and other toxic materials within the ordnance itself.
Got it.
So, helping to clean that up. One is the obvious hazard that it's an explosive device, but then two, just the other potential environmental impacts that go along with it.
So those chemicals or hard metals are soaking into the soil, I'm assuming can probably infiltrate water systems. Those are some of the environmental concerns we're thinking about, beyond just safety, of course.
Yeah, absolutely.
Got it. So how long were you doing that work?
So I joined in July of 2003, and then had stuck with it ever since, and then just recently retired from it here in August.
Congratulations. Thanks for your service.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Yeah. Tell me about what that looked like. You know, you told us that you did some training with other people on how they can work in this sort of job within the military, but what did it look like for you? Were you stationed abroad?
Yes. And so out of the bases that I was stationed at, I got to do an overseas base, which was great, being in Misawa, northern Japan. Beautiful place to be.
Doing EOD work specifically?
Yes, doing EOD work there. But then part of it too, when you're moving around, you go on deployments and stuff like that. And so while I was I did 6 deployments to various places around the world. Some of them include Afghanistan, so I've been to Afghanistan twice. Been to some other places that weren't combat zones. So I got to go to a place called Diego Garcia, which is the middle of the Indian Ocean, and then South Korea and Kyrgyzstan, and then some other places throughout.
You know, when we were talking off air, you told me a little bit about Diego Garcia, your time there. So can you tell the audience about what you saw when you were in Diego Garcia?
Yeah, definitely. And I would say my military experience included a lot of different environmental aspects. And I think when people think of EOD, they're not thinking of like getting rid of ordnance as being like a positive impact in the environment. And so that was a huge impact or contributing factor to get inspired to kind of make my next career dedicated to the military. But also when you're in the military, you get to travel a lot and you get to see a lot of these areas, you know. And so one of the things that I noticed in the Pacific, especially traveling out to Diego Garcia, is kind of just the human footprint out there, you know. And it's kind of stunning because you go to this remote island in the middle of nowhere, and as you're flying over the ocean, you can see trash, you can see just ships, and the amount of garbage washing up on the shores there on the island out there is, you know, it's kind of impressive, and it kind of puts it in perspective, you know, the amount of effort I think that we should be putting into like being more sustainable and reducing our footprints all over.
And you're talking about an island that's so remote that I had never even heard of it until I was playing a game called Wordle, which is like Wordle, if you're familiar, the little word game, except that they show you a picture of a country with no context clues. It's just the outline of it, and then you have to figure out what it is. And when I got to the end, I was like, what is Diego Garcia? And had to look it up. So this is not a place that's inhabited by lots and lots of people, it's really just a base, right? And yet you're still seeing trash washing up on shore and that human footprint.
Yeah, while I was there too, that was later on in my career, so it's after I started my environmental science bachelor's degree, and then I started working on my master's degree for environmental science. And so by that point in time, I was really interested in like anywhere I went, I tried to see like, hey, what's the environmental issues going on here, and then reached out to, there was an office there of environmental scientists working on stuff out there. And one of the things that I found really interesting out there that they worked on was, again, so you see the trash out there, but turned into the microplastics, and the microplastics got into the sand, which increased the temperature of the sand, which then influenced, you know, like the breeding patterns of turtles.
Oh.
And so, yeah, like going out there and just, and when you travel, you get to see this thing, you can go and you engage and you talk to different people, and then you can see like, oh, the trash is out there, but then like the actual impacts of it, and it goes further down into, you know, how it affects the biodiversity and just the aesthetics and everything that's going on.
You mentioned that your bachelor's degree, so you earned your bachelor's and you said and your master's both while you were in the service?
Yeah, definitely. And so like I said, I joined the military because of 9/11, had no idea that I would be interested in doing environmental work later on. And so when I joined the military, I wasn't sure what I wanted to go to school for, and kind of figured I'd hopefully find my path along the way. And so while I was again, doing the EOD stuff, you go out to the bombing ranges and you're cleaning up hazardous waste. But, the other interesting aspects about it is, so you have a bombing range, you're doing this thing, it's so destructive, but it's an isolated area. And so you'll have these like impact areas where, say, pilots are dropping bombs, but that's fenced off. And then on the fences, they have signs like, hey, stay out, there's ordnance here, don't pick it up, don't touch it, stuff like that. And so you have a much outside of, the pilots out there dropping bombs on targets, you have an area that's relatively untouched. And so you'll see stuff out there, and there's projects out there depending on what ranges you go to. They'll have like exotic species out there, a lot of biodiversity, because there's not a lot of human activity out there. And so when I first exposure to that was when I was stationed in McGuire in New Jersey, and they would go out, environmental scientists would go out to the range out there and do like water testings or something else like that. And so they would call our office up and say, hey, we're going out to this range where there could be some relatively dangerous ordnance out there. And so we would go out and help the environmental scientists out there doing water testing or whatever else they're doing. That early on in my career, I didn't really think too much about it, but then I guess it kind of piqued the interest or piqued the curiosity of it. And then about halfway through my career, I realized, like, hey, I need to start going with school and stuff like that. But at that point in time, kind of was like, oh, this environmental science stuff's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
And then started connecting the dots, like, hey, getting rid of ordnance and cleaning this kind of stuff up, has a pretty positive environmental impact. So I just decided to expand on it with an environmental science degree. And then once that started, I just kept going with it.
Yeah.
And so finished my undergraduate environmental science. The Air Force pays through tuition assistance to go through a master's, so I used my tuition assistance to finish a master's degree in it. Again, more is environmental policy and management, and then focused on one of the early environmental law acts that was passed, the National Environmental Policy Act. And so that's what forces environmental or federal agencies, so anytime there's a federal action, they need to do environmental impact statements and assessments and stuff like that. And so at that point in time in my career and education, I'm like, okay, so environmental law is pretty interesting.
Yeah.
And so now that I'm retired, using my GI Bill to keep school going, and then hopefully getting a law degree will really help equip me better to engage environmental issues here in the future.
Right. So you retired, and then you moved to, you retired when you were in outside Dayton, is that right?
Yes.
And so then you and the family moved here to Cleveland.
Yep.
And did you start school right away?
I retired in August, and then I started school on August, I think, 21st.
Okay, great. So you are not really that interested in taking breaks, huh?
No, I don't. Yeah, I feel like I didn't have a choice, so I feel like there was a sense of urgency.
Sure. And
so yeah, no breaks.
You're at Case Western Reserve University, which is a great school. What made you pick Case?
So Case, originally, so when I was planning on retiring, I was in Japan with the family. Circumstances got us back to Wright-Patterson. My wife's from the Cleveland area, and so great support network here for us, great support network for my kids. They have had a fast-paced life too because they've been following me around. So get them into a place where Avon Lake, great schools, they're having a ball, they were around family, and that brought us here. But initially, we were kind of like looking around the area or different schools and looking at strong like environmental law programs. And so this was around like 2020 timeframe, 2021 timeframe. And Case Western recently opened up a Center for Environmental Law, and they got a massive endowment donation from Coleman P. Burke, and so they recently opened up an environmental law center. And so I was really intrigued by that even before we decided to come to Cleveland. And so I think it's an awesome opportunity to go to school there. Really thankful that they're willing to admit me and let me, study the law there. And then I think it's also really interesting, and I think Cleveland should have a really robust environmental law program somewhere in the city, because this is kind of where it all started.
Yeah, totally. I'm curious, why law school? You kind of gave us some of that. You did your master's and there was some public policy, and law can absolutely lead into that, but there's a million ways you can address. You could be doing journalism, you could be doing activism, you could be working at a university. So why law specifically?
That is a really good question. And it is very challenging too.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And hopefully it equips me to it. But law too, I think, one, it helps fight for the environment too. And I mentioned how EOD kind of influenced the environmental decisions and all that other kind of stuff. But also from a military perspective, I think a law degree, one, helps me potentially fight for the environment and hopefully make some huge changes somewhere, someday, making some environmental change. But also you see how those environments can influence and impact veterans as well.
Right.
And so kind of interchangeable, like, yeah, I want to fight for the environment, but I also feel like when I enlisted, there's just such a massive amount of patriotism. And then I was enlisted too. So I joined right at 18 and was part of the enlisted force. And just you meet a lot of really inspiring people that join to do the right thing. And then, you kind of witness a lot of sacrifices and stuff like that. And so I hope to use it to also advocate for veterans and then kind of continue that purpose after retiring of hopefully helping veterans out as well.
Yeah.
And then the veteran thing and the environment thing kind of intersect as well too, because you see legislation about like the PACT Act too. And so when you look at the PACT Act, you have all these service members exposed to toxic burn pits, smoke, Agent Orange, all the other kind of stuff like that. Those are environmental issues directly impacting veterans.
Yeah. Can we back up a bit in case anyone doesn't know what the PACT Act is? Can you give us a little more background on that?
It's essentially like we've had these wars over the years. We go into places like Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and stuff like that. And so when you're going about the operations and you're on these bases, trash needs to go somewhere. And then on top of that, you're going in there and disrupting infrastructure.
Right.
You don't necessarily have the landfills and then what we're used to in America. And so that has to go somewhere. And so back in the War on Terror especially, you burn the garbage. And so all that stuff gets into the air and then you breathe it in and it causes a lot of negative impacts to people with cancer and stuff like that. And so luckily that was passed and hopefully it does right by a lot of veterans and making sure they're getting the care that they want. But just seeing stuff like that contributes to the inspiration to try to do the environmental and the law thing represented too. And I think another thing probably pops up on people's social media is the Camp Lejeune Water Act.
Yeah.
Or Camp Lejeune lawsuit where there's the water issue there. You see the water issues in Pearl Harbor in the news where the fuel leaked into the water.
Right.
Just tragic stuff. You see stuff on the news about base housing and privatized housing. And just from my experience, especially from the enlisted side of it, you see these people join with the best intentions, and I want to make sure that I continue that and hopefully can use this degree and effort to like help that and then make sure that the next generation's joining, that we put a strong concentration that they're living in places that, are environmentally friendly and good for essentially just families and stuff.
When you talked about base housing, can you tell us a little bit about that? You don't have to make any specific call-outs if you don't want to, but what does it mean for families, for veterans and their families? What does bad base housing look like from an environmental perspective?
I think when you see the housing issues, it's just making sure they're maintained. One of the big things you'll see again on social media and then also in the news is like a lot of places will have black mold problems because they don't have like right ventilation or whatever it is. Where they're built, like if you're on an old base, like making sure they're not in an old area that's just toxic, free of asbestos, free of lead bathtubs.
Yes.
Free of just things that normal people should be living with.
Right. And then for families that are living on bases, families don't have to live on base, but there can be benefits or reasons that families do. So do you feel like service people and their families have less choice? Like if you are assigned somewhere and there's bad military housing?
Absolutely. And so I think with the military too, yeah, you can live off base, and a lot of people do have opportunities to live off base, but you also are moving around a lot.
Yes.
And so you'll see changes in the housing markets and stuff like that, which can make it very challenging, especially for, like I mentioned, the lower enlisted.
Yes.
So when you're lower enlisted and you're enlisted, sometimes when you're, a new sergeant coming up and you have a new family, it can be tough to afford a house off base.
Yeah.
And so you got to live on base.
Yeah, and they'll give you an assignment. I mean, depending on the base, but you can walk in and they'll say, this is your house.
Yep, this is your house.
Not really a lot of choice. When I was in college, I worked for a private company on a military base, and my job was to move soldiers in and out of their homes with their families and make sure that everything was good for them. But I can tell you from my experience, most of is it good for them was like, is it clean? Do all the doors and windows work, and not so much like I was a 19-year-old and I was doing inspections. So maybe not always the best situation to make sure that housing quality is really there.
Yeah. And so just you see the impacts there. And then, like I said, the EOD stuff, and then just kind of all intertwining it together. I don't know what issues that I'll end up battling, but hopefully it'll be something along those lines.
Yeah, definitely. I know we're jumping back a little bit, but I just kept realizing that I didn't ask this question that I think is important. When you talk about responsibly cleaning up some of these ordinances and other hazardous waste, what does that look like? I mean, if it's irresponsible to leave it, like what are we doing with it instead?
Yeah, well, there's so many different situations that go along with it. And so you have the war zone things. That's pretty straightforward. You drop something, or somebody throws a grenade, or you launch artillery and it doesn't go off. Or we saw a lot in Afghanistan and Iraq, just stockpiles of old weapons. And so that probably is the easiest explanation. Is you see an old stockpile of weapons, one of EOD's jobs, they call it weapon caches. You find one of these old weapons caches, we'll take it out, kind of stack it up, and then we'll detonate it with explosives. And so it eliminates that hazard, and then the explosion should consume all the old explosives and then the hazards that then go along with it.
Got it. So sometimes the way to clean it up is just to blow everything up.
Yeah, just blow it all up.
That's not what I was expecting you to say, but yeah, I'm learning a lot.
And then there's other situations too. You'll see in the States, I mentioned on bombing ranges, is so we'll go out there and essentially you pick it up and then you stack it up. And again, you put explosives on it and then the explosion consumes it. And then
sounds like a dangerous job.
It can be dangerous, but also really exciting. I think there are a lot of young boys or men out there that would think that, hey, getting paid to blow something up is pretty cool.
I think that's probably what motivated my little brother to join too. But
yeah, so I mean, there's definitely fun things about it. It can be pretty dangerous, but you get you take a lot of safety precautions and safety measures that really reduces it. So
yeah.
Although
it didn't 100% help you, because I think you told me you are a Purple Heart recipient. Is that right?
Yeah.
So safety precautions, but still there's risk.
Yeah. Sometimes you can't find all of them.
Yeah.
So So one of my trips to Afghanistan on a convoy, and our vehicle ended up finding one. So
he says with a smile. Yeah.
Well, I'm still here.
Yeah.
Still here, and just thankful, to be able to live through the experience, and again have the opportunity to be at the point where I could retire from it, and then hopefully give back to the next generation that hopefully doesn't go through that kind of stuff. But if they do, know that there's people out there that want to help them and make sure that everything's being done right for them. I
love that. So I'm excited for you to continue with your law school career and then become a cool lawyer doing a lot of work on the environment and also for veterans. But if someone watching thinks that they want to go down that same kind of path, what advice would you give them as far as like picking the right school for them or getting into law school if that's the way that they want to do their advocacy?
From like going from the military to law school, or just anybody?
Well, I guess maybe anybody, but you've got this really specific desire to serve both environmental causes and veterans in this really interesting intersection. So if someone else feels like you do, what would you say to them?
I would say I think this is like kind of goes a couple different directions. I think if you're enlisted and you didn't have a degree when you signed up, that you need to do your degree and start right now. So sign up, do your degree right now, because it's going to open a lot of doors when you get out.
Do you hear that, little brother?
Yeah. Do your degree right now. There's no reason not to. So they give you what's called tuition assistance. Start your degree. Do the best you can. Get good grades. And then go with that.
Yeah.
And then I think my perspective's a little bit different from somebody that does it the traditional path to it. But it's really interesting, really rewarding. And I just, now that I'm at this phase of my life, just appreciate the privilege to be able to kind of learn more about it.
Yeah. Well, Doug, I feel like I could ask you 1,000 more questions, but I know we don't have time for that today. So it's been wonderful talking to you. I learned a lot, and I hope others did too. I'm really excited about the work that you're doing, or maybe the work that you're going to be doing. Right now, you're taking constitutional law and figuring out the basics.
I'm glad to talk about like EOD stuff, but I'm really new to the law stuff.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
Let's get some experience there first.
We'll get you in after you do an internship and see how things are going.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
Until then, thank you so much for coming and sharing your experiences with me. It's been wonderful to talk to you. I'm going to let everybody know how they can keep up to date with our show. Sound good?
Definitely. Thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
Thank you. If you'd like to stay connected with us, be sure to follow us on TikTok at ATG Show. And if you'd like to rewatch full episodes, check out our YouTube channel, All Things Green Show. You can find all of our sources from today's episode in our show notes. All Things Green will be back at the same time next week. Thank you, Doug, for being a part of the global sustainability movement.
Definitely thank you.